You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, a woman walked into my courtroom carrying grief so heavy I could feel it from where I sat. She had just come from her mother's wake, and someone had given her a parking ticket while she was inside saying goodbye. What happened next, what I said to her, what I decided in that moment, it reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. And when the next case was called, when I saw how one person treated this grieving daughter, I made a decision that surprised even me. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about compassion, about character, and about what it really means to serve justice. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a municipal court judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 4 decades now. Every morning I wake up at 6, make myself a strong cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and I sit at my kitchen table reading the Providence Journal before the sun comes up. My wife, Joyce, knows not to talk to me until I've finished that coffee. She's learned that over 48 years of marriage. By 7:30, I'm in my car driving down the same streets I've driven for most of my life. I pass the bakery where my father used to buy bread when we had nothing. I pass the church where I was married. I pass the neighborhoods where families are just starting their days, kids waiting for school buses, people heading to work. I get to the courthouse at 8:15. I've done it the same way since 1984. My clerk, Christina, is always there before me. She's been with me for 22 years. She knows how I like things organized. She knows when I'm going to have a tough day before I know it myself. That Tuesday morning, she had my coffee ready, stronger than usual. She looked at me and said, "Judge, we've got a full docket today, 63 cases." I remember nodding, hanging up my coat, and heading into my chambers to put on my robes. My father came to this country from Italy with $7 in his pocket and a dream that his children would have better lives than he had. He worked construction until his hands were rough as sandpaper. He never complained, not once. He taught me something that I've carried with me every single day of my career. He said, "Franco, when you have power over others, you use it with mercy. You remember that everyone has a story. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. So you listen. You really listen." Those words have guided every decision I've made from this bench. That particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. I could sense it when I walked into the courtroom. The gallery was more crowded than usual. I saw faces I recognized, regular folks who come through for parking tickets, traffic violations, the small infractions that make up most of my docket. But I also saw some new faces, people who looked worried, people who looked like they were carrying the weight of the world. I took my seat at the bench at exactly 9 o'clock. I looked out at the courtroom, my courtroom, and I said what I say every morning. "Good morning, everyone. We're here to conduct the business of justice with respect and fairness. I expect courtesy from everyone in this room. That includes me. That includes all of you. Let's begin." Christina called the first case, a young man with 3 unpaid parking tickets. I listened to his explanation. He was working 2 jobs, trying to support his family, and he simply forgot about the tickets in the chaos of his life. I looked at him, and I could see my own father in his face, working hard, trying to do right, just overwhelmed by circumstance. I reduced his fines and set up a payment plan he could actually afford. I watched relief wash over him. He thanked me 3 times before he left. Those moments, they're why I still put on these robes. The morning moved along steadily. A woman with an expired registration, a man who parked in a loading zone. Each case, each person, each story. I listened to all of them. I've learned that people don't come to court because everything in their life is going perfectly. They come because something went wrong. And my job isn't to make their day worse. My job is to enforce the law fairly while remembering that I'm dealing with human beings, not just case numbers. Around 10:30, Christina called the next case. Linda Martinez, parking violation, unpaid meter. I looked down at the file. $50 fine. I looked up and I watched as a woman in her mid-50s walked slowly toward the front of my courtroom. The first thing I noticed was how tired she looked. Not just tired like she didn't sleep well, tired in her bones, tired in her soul. She was wearing scrubs under her coat, medical scrubs. Her eyes were red. I could tell immediately that she had been crying. She stood before me and I could see her hands shaking slightly as she held a folder against her chest. I said, "Ms. Martinez, I see you're here regarding a parking ticket you received on November 18th. Can you tell me what happened?" My voice was gentle. I could feel that she needed gentleness right then. She looked up at me and took a breath that seemed to hurt her. She said, "Your Honor, I was at Lucia's funeral home that morning. My mother passed away 4 days before. We were having her wake. I parked on the street outside, and I know I should have fed the meter, but I couldn't think straight. I was saying goodbye to my mother. I felt something catch in my chest. I've buried both my parents. I know that grief. I know how it clouds everything, how the simplest tasks become impossible when your heart is breaking." I leaned forward and I said, "Ms. Martinez, I'm very sorry for your loss. Please, tell me about your mother." She wasn't expecting that. Nobody expects a judge to ask about their mother, but I genuinely wanted to know. I saw tears start to form in her eyes again, and she said, "Her name was Rosa. She was 78. She came here from Guatemala 50 years ago. She worked as a housekeeper her whole life. She cleaned office buildings at night so she could take care of us during the day. She never learned to speak English very well, but she taught us everything about hard work, about family, about love." I nodded slowly. I said, "She sounds like a remarkable woman. My own father was an immigrant. He worked until his hands bled to give us a better life. I understand what you've lost." I looked down at the ticket again. I saw that it had been issued at 9:45 in the morning, right in the middle of when her wake would have been happening. I said, "Ms. Martinez, you're a nurse, I see from your scrubs." She nodded. "I work at Rhode Island Hospital, ICU, night shift mostly. I had taken the week off for my mother's funeral. The wake was that Tuesday morning, and the burial was the next day. I was so exhausted, so heartbroken, I just parked and walked inside. I didn't even see the meter. Something about her reminded me of my own mother, my mother who worked in a textile factory for 30 years, my mother who never complained, never asked for anything, just gave and gave and gave until she had nothing left to give. I thought about how devastated I was at her funeral, how I could barely function, how the world seemed to move in slow motion. I looked at Ms. Martinez and I said, "I'm going to tell you something. The law says you parked at an expired meter. The law says that violation carries a $50 fine. But the law also gives me discretion. It gives me the ability to look at circumstances, to look at the human being standing in front of me and make a decision based on justice, not just rules. Your mother just passed away. You were at her wake. You were doing something that every good daughter does, honoring the woman who gave you life." I picked up my gavel and I said, "Ms. Martinez, this ticket is dismissed, with my deepest condolences for your loss. Your mother would be proud of the woman you are. Case dismissed." I watched as tears rolled down her cheeks. She put her hand over her mouth and she said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much." I could hear the relief in her voice. Not just about the $50, though I'm sure that mattered, but relief that someone had seen her grief. Someone had acknowledged her pain. Someone had treated her like a human being in the middle of the worst week of her life. She walked back through my courtroom, and I saw several people in the gallery nodding in approval. I saw an older woman reach out and squeeze Ms. Martinez's hand as she passed. I felt good about that decision. I felt like I had done what my father would have wanted me to do. I had used my power with mercy. Christina called the next case, and I handled it, then another, then another. The mourning continued, but I kept thinking about Linda Martinez. I kept thinking about her mother, Rosa, who had worked so hard for her family. I kept thinking about how a parking enforcement officer had written that ticket while a daughter was inside saying goodbye to the woman who raised her. I wasn't angry at the officer. They were doing their job. They had no way of knowing, but I was grateful that I had the chance to make it right. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever lost someone you loved? Have you ever been in that fog of grief where you can barely remember your own name, much less worry about parking meters? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, if this is reminding you that there are still people out there who care about doing the right thing, hit that like button for me. It was around 11:15 when I heard something that made me stop mid-sentence. I was in the middle of another case when I heard a loud, dismissive laugh come from the back of my courtroom. Not a quiet chuckle, a full, contemptuous laugh that echoed off the walls. I stopped talking. I looked up from my papers and I scanned the gallery to see where it had come from. That's when I saw her for the first time. A woman sitting in the third row, wearing what I could tell was an expensive coat, fur collar, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, even though we were indoors. She was looking at her phone, typing away, completely oblivious to the fact that court was in session. She had laughed at something on her screen in my courtroom while I was conducting official business. I felt my jaw tighten. I said, "Excuse me," the woman in the third row. "This is a courtroom, not a movie theater. Please put your phone away and show some respect for these proceedings." She looked up at me with this expression of surprise, like she couldn't believe I was speaking to her. She made a big show of putting her phone in her purse, rolling her eyes as she did it. I saw it clearly, the eye roll, the attitude. It told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed being here. I finished the case I was on, and then Christina called the next one. She said, "Case number 7249, Rebecca Whitmore, multiple parking violations." I looked at the file. 3 unpaid tickets over the past 6 months. Total of $450 in fines. All from the same area downtown. All from parking in handicapped spaces without a permit. I said, "Rebecca Whitmore." And I watched as the woman with the fur collar stood up and walked toward me. She moved slowly, like she had all the time in the world. Like everyone else in my courtroom was just waiting for her convenience. She was wearing heels that clicked loudly on the floor. Designer handbag. Jewelry that probably cost more than most people in that room made in 6 months. But it wasn't the expensive clothes that bothered me. I've seen wealthy people in my courtroom before. Some of them are kind and respectful. It was the attitude, the way she carried herself like she was doing us all a favor by showing up. She stood before my bench and I said, "Ms. Whitmore, you're here today regarding 3 parking violations. All 3 citations were issued because you parked in handicapped parking spaces without the proper permit. Do you understand the charges?" She looked at me and I swear I saw her smirk. She said, "Your Honor, I understand the charges, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. Those parking spaces were the only ones available near the stores I needed to visit. I was only there for a few minutes each time. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, those spaces aren't for people who can't find convenient parking. Those spaces are legally designated for people with disabilities, people who need them. Did you see the signs?" She shrugged, actually shrugged at me. She said, "I saw them, but like I said, I was only there briefly. It's not like I was preventing someone from parking there." I had to take a deep breath. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've developed pretty good control over my emotions. But I felt my blood pressure rising. I said, "How do you know you weren't preventing someone from parking there? How do you know that someone with a disability didn't drive by, see your car in that space, and have to park far away and struggle to get to where they needed to go?" She looked at me with this blank expression and said, "I suppose that's possible, but it didn't happen. I would have seen them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "You would have seen them? You were inside shopping. How would you have seen anything?" She was starting to look annoyed now, like I was the one being unreasonable. She said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think this is being blown out of proportion. I'm willing to pay the fines. Can we just finish this?" I looked down at my papers to give myself a moment. I saw that each ticket was for $150. The law allows me to double fines for handicapped parking violations. I was considering doing exactly that. But then I thought about something else. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, what do you do for a living?" She seemed surprised by the question. She said, "I'm in real estate, commercial real estate. I invest in properties." I nodded. I said, "So you're familiar with the law. You understand property regulations, zoning, legal requirements." She looked a bit smug when she answered. She said, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm very familiar with the law." "Good," I said. "Then you understand that handicapped parking spaces are not suggestions. They're legal requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You understand that people who need those spaces rely on them. People who can't walk long distances, people in wheelchairs, veterans who sacrificed for this country and came home with injuries, elderly people who have earned the right to whatever small convenience we can provide them." She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her confidence was starting to waver just slightly. She said, "I understand that, Your Honor. And like I said, I'm willing to pay the fines. That's why I'm here." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "You're here because you were summoned to court. These tickets are 6 months old. You ignored 3 separate citations. You didn't pay them. You didn't contest them. You just ignored them like they didn't apply to you." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. I said, "Let me tell you about something that happened earlier this morning. A woman came into this courtroom who had received a parking ticket while attending her mother's wake. Her mother had just died. She was saying goodbye. She forgot to feed the meter because her heart was breaking. I dismissed her ticket because that's what compassion looks like. That's what understanding circumstance means." I saw Rebecca Whitmore's expression harden. She didn't like being compared unfavorably to Linda Martinez. I continued. I said, "You, on the other hand, parked in handicapped spaces 3 separate times because it was convenient for you, because you couldn't be bothered to walk an extra 50 feet, because you think the rules don't apply to you. Am I understanding this correctly?" She was getting defensive now. I could see it in her posture. She said, "Your Honor, I really don't appreciate the lecture. I came here to resolve this. I'll pay the fines. Can we please move on?" The way she said it, the dismissive tone, it reminded me of every entitled person I've ever encountered. People who think money solves everything. People who think they can buy their way out of consequences. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, this isn't about money. This is about respect. Respect for the law. Respect for people who need those parking spaces. Respect for this court." She actually rolled her eyes again. I saw it clearly, and then she said something that I'll never forget in 40 years of being a judge. She said, "Your Honor, I spend more on my car payment each month than these fines. This is really just an inconvenience for me. Can we finish this so I can get back to my day?" The courtroom went completely silent. I heard someone behind her gasp. I saw Christina close her eyes and shake her head slowly. I felt every eye in that room turn to look at me, waiting to see how I would respond. I had to take another deep breath. I had to remind myself that I'm a professional, that I represent the dignity of this court, that I can't let my personal feelings override my responsibility to be fair. I said, and I kept my voice very level, "Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to tell you something my father taught me. He came to this country with nothing. He worked construction for 40 years. He taught me that respect isn't something you buy. It's something you earn through your actions, through your character, through how you treat other people. You haven't earned any respect here today. Look, I need to ask you for a favor. If this story's resonating with you, if you're feeling what I felt in that moment, hit that subscribe button for me. It helps me share these lessons with more people who need to hear them. And let me know in the comments, have you ever encountered someone like this? Someone who thinks money puts them above the rules? I want to hear your stories." Rebecca Whitmore was staring at me now with her arms crossed. I could see she was angry. She said, "Are you going to fine me or not?" I looked at her and I said, "Oh, I'm going to fine you. I'm fining you the maximum penalty for each violation. $300 per ticket. That's $900 total." She barely blinked. She said, "Fine, I'll write you a check right now." But I wasn't finished. I said, "And I'm also ordering you to complete 20 hours of community service. You're going to volunteer at the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. You're going to spend time with people who actually need those handicapped parking spaces. You're going to learn why those spaces exist. You're going to understand what you were too self-absorbed to consider. Now her expression changed. Now I saw real annoyance. She said, Your Honor, I don't have time for community service. I have a business to run. I have commitments. I said, Then you should have thought about that before you parked illegally 3 times. You should have thought about that before you came into my courtroom with this attitude. You have 60 days to complete the 20 hours, or you'll face additional penalties. Do you understand? She was furious now. I could see it in the way her face flushed. She said, This is ridiculous. You dismissed that other woman's ticket completely, and you're punishing me like I committed some major crime. This isn't fair. And that's when I stood up from my bench. I rarely do that. But I wanted her to understand how serious I was. I wanted everyone in that courtroom to understand. I said, You want to talk about fair? Let me explain something to you. That woman, Linda Martinez, she made an honest mistake in the middle of devastating grief. She was at her mother's funeral. You made deliberate choices to break the law 3 separate times because you decided your convenience was more important than other people's needs. That's not the same thing, not even close. I continued. I said, Fair is treating people according to their circumstances and their character. Fair is showing mercy to those who deserve it and holding accountable those who think they're above the law. Fair is making sure that someone with money doesn't get to act like rules don't apply to them while someone who's struggling gets crushed by the system. That's what fair looks like in my courtroom. She just stared at me. She didn't know what to say. I could see her jaw working like she was trying to find words. Finally, she said, Fine, I'll pay the fines and do the community service. Can I go now? I sat back down and I said, Not quite yet. I'm also suspending your parking privileges in downtown Providence for 6 months. If you're caught parking anywhere in the downtown district during that time, you'll face additional penalties, including possible jail time. Do you understand? Her mouth fell open. She said, You can't do that. How am I supposed to conduct business? I looked at her and I said, The same way millions of people do every day. You can take public transportation. You can walk. You can use ride-sharing services. You'll figure it out. Maybe it will teach you the value of those parking spaces you took for granted. I picked up my gavel and I said, $900 in fines, 20 hours of community service at the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living, 6-month parking ban in downtown Providence. You have 60 days to complete the community service and you can pay the fines to the clerk on your way out. Case closed. I brought the gavel down hard. The sound echoed through my courtroom. Rebecca Whitmore stood there for a moment like she couldn't believe what had just happened. Then she grabbed her expensive handbag, turned on her heel, and walked out of my courtroom with her head held high. But I noticed her hands were shaking when she reached for the door. I noticed she didn't look quite as confident as when she'd walked in. The courtroom was buzzing. I could hear people whispering. I saw several people nodding in approval. An older man in the back actually started clapping, but stopped when he remembered he was in court. I looked out at everyone and I said, Let's take a 15-minute recess. When we come back, we'll resume the docket. I stood up and walked back to my chambers. Christina followed me. She closed the door behind her and she said, Judge, that was something. I've never seen you that firm with someone. I sat down in my chair and I rubbed my eyes. I was tired. I said, Christina, I've been doing this too long to let people like that treat this courtroom like it's a minor inconvenience. The law applies to everyone equally. Rich, poor, doesn't matter. She nodded. She said, That Martinez woman was still in the hallway when Whitmore walked out. They passed each other. I looked up. I said, Did Whitmore say anything? Christina shook her head. She said no. But Linda Martinez looked at her and I saw compassion in her eyes. After everything she's going through, after losing her mother, she looked at that entitled woman with compassion. That's the difference between them, Judge. That's character. I nodded slowly. Christina was right. That was character. That was the difference between someone who had suffered and learned empathy and someone who had never had to think about anyone but themselves. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling with something. I was questioning whether I'd been too harsh, whether I'd let my personal feelings about Rebecca Whitmore's attitude cloud my judgment. I kept thinking about my responsibility to be fair, to be impartial. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, what I discovered about this situation, I never saw coming in my entire career. The 15-minute recess ended, and I went back into the courtroom. I finished the rest of my morning docket. More parking tickets, a couple of traffic violations, a noise complaint, the usual business of municipal court. But my mind kept drifting back to those two women. Linda Martinez, with her grief and her grace. Rebecca Whitmore, with her entitlement and her anger. I kept thinking about how different people respond to the world, depending on what they've experienced, what they've learned, what they value. Around 1 o'clock, I broke for lunch. I usually eat in my chambers. A sandwich Christina picks up for me from the deli down the street. I was sitting there, eating my turkey on rye, when there was a knock on my door. I said, "Come in." The door opened and I saw Linda Martinez standing there. She looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should be there. I stood up immediately. I said, "Ms. Martinez, please come in. Is everything okay?" She stepped inside, and I could see she'd been crying again, but these seemed like different tears. She said, "Your Honor, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to come back and thank you properly for what you did this morning, for your kindness." I motioned for her to sit down in one of my chairs. I said, "Please sit. You're not disturbing me at all." She sat down and she was holding something in her hands, a small photo album. She said, "I wanted you to see her, my mother. I wanted you to know who she was." She opened the album and showed me pictures. An elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, photos of her with her family, at birthday parties, at graduations, at what looked like a 50th wedding anniversary celebration. I looked at each photo carefully. I said, "She had a beautiful smile. You can see the love in her eyes." Linda nodded and tears started falling again. She said, "She loved us so much. Everything she did was for us. And yesterday, having to say goodbye, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. When I got that parking ticket, when I saw it on my windshield, I just broke down. I sat in my car and I cried because it felt like one more thing, one more piece of stress on top of this grief." I reached across my desk and I handed her a tissue from the box I keep there. I said, "I lost my mother 12 years ago. I still miss her every single day. The grief doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes something you carry with you, something that reminds you of how much you love them." She wiped her eyes and said, "That's what the funeral director told me." She said, "The pain means the love was real." I nodded. I said, "That's exactly right." And Linda, what I did this morning, dismissing that ticket, that wasn't a favor. That was justice. That was recognizing that you're a human being in pain, not just a case number. She smiled at me through her tears. She said, "You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who care." After I left the courtroom, I was in the hallway when that other woman walked out, the one who was after me. I leaned forward. I said, "Rebecca Whitmore." Linda nodded. She said, "I heard some of what you said to her about the handicapped parking spaces, about respect. And, Your Honor, I want you to know something. My mother, in her last years, she needed a wheelchair. She had severe arthritis. She couldn't walk more than a few feet without pain. Those handicapped spaces, they made it possible for her to still go to church, to still go to the grocery store, to still have some independence." She continued. She said, "But so many times we would get to a parking lot and all the handicapped spaces would be taken by people who didn't have permits, people who just didn't want to walk. We would have to park far away, and I would watch my mother struggle, watch her be in pain, all because someone couldn't be bothered to follow the rules." What you said to that woman today, the way you held her accountable, that mattered. That really mattered. I felt my throat get tight. I said, "Your mother was lucky to have you. I could tell from how you spoke about her that you took good care of her." Linda smiled and said, "I tried. I'm a nurse, so I knew how to help with her medical needs. But more than that, I just wanted her to know she was loved. that she wasn't a burden, that everything she'd done for us, we were honored to do for her. We sat there in silence for a moment. Then Linda stood up. She said, "I should let you finish your lunch. I just wanted to thank you and to show you who my mother was." I stood up too and I shook her hand. I said, "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for sharing her with me. And Linda, I mean this. If you ever need anything, you call this court. You ask for me, okay?" She nodded, squeezed my hand, and left. I sat back down at my desk, but I couldn't eat anymore. I just thought about what she'd said, about her mother in a wheelchair, about struggling to find parking because people like Rebecca Whitmore decided their convenience mattered more than someone else's need. It reinforced for me that I'd made the right decision, that sometimes being a judge means more than just applying fines. It means teaching lessons about character, about community, about how we're supposed to treat each other. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. Do you think I was right to come down so hard on Rebecca Whitmore? Or should I have just fined her and moved on? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave me a comment because I want to know. And if you believe that entitled people need to be held accountable, that money shouldn't protect you from consequences, hit that subscribe button. Show me that you believe in equal justice. The afternoon session started at 2. I had another full docket to get through. I was about halfway through when something unexpected happened. My clerk, Christina, came up to the bench and leaned in to whisper to me. She said, "Judge, there's a woman here from the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. She says she needs to speak with you. It's about the community service order you issued this morning." I looked at the clock. It had only been a few hours since I'd ordered Rebecca Whitmore to do community service there. I said, "Tell her I'll speak with her during the next recess." Christina nodded and went to relay the message. I finished the case I was on, handled 2 more, and then called for another break. I went back to my chambers and Christina showed in a woman probably in her early 60s. She was in a wheelchair. She had short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She extended her hand to me and said, "Judge Caprio, I'm Margaret Foster. I'm the director of the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. Thank you for seeing me." I shook her hand and said, "Of course, please, come in. What can I do for you?" She wheeled herself into my office and positioned her chair across from my desk. She said, "I heard through the grapevine that you ordered someone to complete community service at our center, someone who parked in handicapped spaces. I wanted to come talk to you about it." I nodded. I said, "Yes, that's correct. Rebecca Whitmore, 20 hours of community service. I thought working with your organization might help her understand why those parking spaces are so important." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was knowing. She said, "Judge, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I want you to understand something. People like that, people who park in our spaces, they come through our program sometimes. Most of them don't learn anything. They show up, they do their hours, they check the box, and they go right back to their entitled behavior. They see us as objects of pity, not as human beings with rights." I leaned back in my chair. I said, "So you think I'm wasting your time?" She shook her head. She said, "No, I didn't say that. I said most of them don't learn, but some do. Some of them come in with their attitudes and their assumptions, and something gets through. They meet someone who changes how they see the world. So we'll take her. We'll put her to work. We'll try to teach her. But I wanted you to know that this isn't a magic solution." I appreciated her honesty. I said, "Margaret, can I tell you why I did it? Why I didn't just fine her and move on?" She nodded. So I told her about the morning, about Linda Martinez and her mother's wake, about how I'd dismissed that ticket with compassion, and then about Rebecca Whitmore walking in with her expensive clothes and her attitude, parking in handicapped spaces multiple times because it was convenient, telling me that the fines meant nothing to her. I said I wanted her to understand that those spaces aren't abstract. They're for real people, people with names and families and lives, people who need them. I thought maybe if she spent time with your community, if she heard stories, if she saw the challenges people face, maybe it would crack through that shell of entitlement. Margaret listened carefully. When I finished, she said, "Judge, let me tell you a story. 3 years ago, a young man was ordered to do community service with us. Similar situation. He'd been parking in handicapped spaces at his gym because he didn't want to walk from the far lot. She continued. She said, he came in angry, resentful. He saw it as punishment. The first day we assigned him to help with our adaptive sports program. He had to help set up equipment for wheelchair basketball. He was going through the motions, not really engaging. Then one of our members, a veteran who'd lost his legs in Iraq, started talking to him. Just casual conversation. Asked him about his life, his job, his family, treated him like a human being. Margaret's eyes got a little misty. She said, that veteran told him his story about serving his country, about the IED that changed his life forever, about coming home and learning to navigate a world that wasn't built for him, about how something as simple as a parking space close to a building entrance meant he could still be independent, still work, still contribute. That young man, his whole attitude changed. By the end of his service hours, he was volunteering to stay longer. He ended up becoming a regular volunteer. He told me that veteran changed his life. I smiled. I said, so it can work. Margaret nodded. She said, it can. I can't promise it will with this woman, but we'll try. We'll give her the same chance we give everyone. I stood up and shook her hand again. I said, that's all I can ask. Thank you for coming to talk to me about this. She wheeled toward the door and then stopped and turned back. She said, Judge, what you did this morning, standing up for our community, it matters. Too many people think parking in our spaces is a minor thing. It's not minor to us. It's about respect, about dignity, about the right to access the world like everyone else. So thank you. After she left, I sat at my desk thinking about what she'd said, about how some people learn and some people don't, about how we have to keep trying anyway, about how the law is one tool but changing hearts. That's something different. That requires human connection, requires someone seeing themselves in another person's struggle. I hoped Rebecca Whitmore would be one of the ones who learned, but I honestly wasn't sure. You know, this is exactly why I still put on these robes every morning after 40 years, for moments like these, when justice isn't just about fines and penalties. It's about trying to make people better, trying to build a community where people actually care about each other. If that means something to you, if you believe in that, show me by hitting that like button and subscribing. Let me know I'm not alone in believing this stuff matters. The next few weeks went by and I didn't hear anything about Rebecca Whitmore. I assumed she was either completing her community service or ignoring the order and building up more penalties. I handled my regular docket, more cases, more people, more stories. Some days I felt like I was making a difference. Some days I felt like I was just moving paper around. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks after that day in court, I got a phone call in my chambers. Christina buzzed me and said, Judge Margaret Foster is on the line. I picked up the phone and said, Margaret, hello, how are you? She said, I'm good, Judge. I'm calling because I wanted to give you an update on Rebecca Whitmore. I sat up straighter in my chair. I said, how's it going? Margaret laughed. She said, well, it's interesting. She showed up for her first session with a major attitude, made it clear she thought this was beneath her. We assigned her to help in our computer lab. We teach people with disabilities how to use adaptive technology. She sat in the corner looking at her phone for the first hour. Then one of our members, a woman named Patricia, who has cerebral palsy, needed help with something. Patricia uses adaptive software to control her computer because she doesn't have fine motor control in her hands. Margaret continued. She said, Rebecca ignored her at first, but Patricia is persistent. She kept asking for help. Finally, Rebecca went over there, clearly annoyed. Patricia asked her to help adjust something on her equipment, and then Patricia started talking to her, just friendly conversation, asked Rebecca about her work, her family, normal stuff. And Rebecca, she started to soften, just a little. By the end of that first session, I saw Rebecca actually smile at something Patricia said. I was listening carefully. I said, that's a good start. Margaret said, it is. She's been back twice more since then. She's still got attitude, but less of it. Last week, she actually stayed 15 minutes past her required time because she was helping Patricia work on a resume. Patricia is trying to get a job in customer service. Rebecca, with her business background, was giving her advice. Real advice. Helpful advice. I could hear in her voice that she was starting to see Patricia as a person, not just an obligation. I smiled. I said, "Margaret, that's exactly what I was hoping for." She said, "It's early still. She's got a lot more hours to complete. But I wanted you to know that your instinct might have been right. Sometimes people just need to be put in a position where they have to see beyond themselves." I thanked her for the call and for the update. After we hung up, I sat there feeling something I don't always feel in this job. Hope. Hope that maybe I'd made a decision that would actually change someone. Another 2 weeks went by. I had mostly forgotten about the case. I was dealing with the daily flow of people and problems that come through my courtroom. Then on a Tuesday morning, almost 6 weeks after the original case, I looked up during a session and I saw Rebecca Whitmore sitting in the gallery. She wasn't there for a case. She was just sitting there, watching. I was surprised, but I didn't say anything. I finished the morning docket, and when I called a recess, I saw her stand up and approach Christina. I went back to my chambers, and a few minutes later, Christina knocked on my door. She said, "Judge, Rebecca Whitmore is here. She's asking if she can speak with you for a few minutes." I was curious. I said, "Send her in." Christina opened the door wider, and Rebecca walked into my chambers. She looked different than she had 6 weeks ago. She was dressed more casually, no fur collar, no designer sunglasses. She looked nervous. I gestured to a chair and said, "Ms. Whitmore, please sit. What can I do for you?" She sat down and took a breath. She said, "Your Honor, I wanted to come talk to you. I've completed my 20 hours of community service at the Center for Independent Living." She handed me some paperwork that verified her completion. I looked it over and nodded. I said, "Congratulations. I hope it was a worthwhile experience." She looked down at her hands. She said, "It was more than worthwhile. It was eye-opening. Your Honor, I owe you an apology. The way I acted in your courtroom that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was dismissive. I treated those parking violations like they were nothing, because to me, they were nothing. The money didn't matter. The rules didn't seem important. I was only thinking about myself." I watched her carefully. I could tell this wasn't easy for her to say. I said, "I appreciate you saying that. What changed?" She looked up at me, and I saw something different in her eyes. "Humility," she said. "I met people who made me see things differently. There was a woman named Patricia. She has cerebral palsy. She's brilliant, funny, determined. She's been applying for jobs for months and getting rejected, not because she's not qualified, but because companies see her disability and make assumptions. She told me about how she needs those handicapped parking spaces because getting from her car to a building entrance is exhausting for her. It's not lazy. It's not an excuse. It's her reality." Rebecca continued. She said, "I also met a veteran named Marcus. He lost both his legs serving in Afghanistan. He told me about coming home and trying to rebuild his life, about how hard it is to do simple things that I take for granted, about how many times he's gotten to a store or a restaurant and all the handicapped spaces are taken by people who don't need them, how he's had to turn around and go home because he can't make that long walk. I never thought about any of that. I never considered that my convenience was someone else's barrier." I leaned forward. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, I'm glad you had those experiences. I'm glad you met those people. That's exactly why I ordered the community service. But I need to ask you something. Is this genuine, or is this you telling me what you think I want to hear?" She met my eyes directly. She said, "Your Honor, 6 weeks ago I would have told you whatever you wanted to hear just to get out of here. But this is real. I spent 48 hours at that center. I heard stories that broke my heart. I met people who face challenges every single day that I can't even imagine. And I realized that I've been living in a bubble where I thought money and success meant I was better than other people. I was wrong. I sat back in my chair. I said, "That's a big realization. What are you going to do with it?" She took another breath. She said, "I've actually asked Margaret if I can keep volunteering. I want to help with their job placement program. I have connections in the business community. I can help people like Patricia get interviews, get jobs. I can use my privilege for something good instead of just using it to make my own life easier. And Your Honor, I've also started a fundraiser. I'm raising money to install better accessible parking and entrance ramps at several buildings I own downtown." I have to admit, I was surprised. This was more than I'd expected. I said, "That's admirable. I'm impressed." She smiled a little. She said, "I also wanted to tell you that I saw Linda Martinez at the center, the woman who was in court before me that day, the one whose mother had passed away." I looked surprised and she explained. She said, "She volunteers there once a month. She's been doing it for years. When I met her, she didn't know who I was at first. She was just kind to me, welcoming. Later, when she realized I was the woman from court that day, she still treated me with kindness. After everything she was going through, she still had compassion for a stranger." Another 2 weeks went by. I had mostly forgotten about the case. I was dealing with the daily flow of people and problems that come through my courtroom. Then on a Tuesday morning, almost 6 weeks after the original case, I looked up during a session and I saw Rebecca Whitmore sitting in the gallery. She wasn't there for a case. She was just sitting there, watching. I was surprised, but I didn't say anything. I finished the morning docket, and when I called a recess, I saw her stand up and approach Christina. I went back to my chambers, and a few minutes later, Christina knocked on my door. She said, "Judge, Rebecca Whitmore is here. She's asking if she can speak with you for a few minutes." I was curious. I said, "Send her in." Christina opened the door wider, and Rebecca walked into my chambers. She looked different than she had 6 weeks ago. She was dressed more casually. No fur collar, no designer sunglasses. She looked nervous. I gestured to a chair and said, "Ms. Whitmore, please sit. What can I do for you?" She sat down and took a breath. She said, "Your Honor, I wanted to come talk to you. I've completed my 20 hours of community service at the Center for Independent Living." She handed me some paperwork that verified her completion. I looked it over and nodded. I said, "Congratulations. I hope it was a worthwhile experience." She looked down at her hands. She said, "It was more than worthwhile. It was eye-opening." "Your Honor, I owe you an apology. The way I acted in your courtroom that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was dismissive. I treated those parking violations like they were nothing because to me, they were nothing. The money didn't matter. The rules didn't seem important. I was only thinking about myself." I watched her carefully. I could tell this wasn't easy for her to say. I said, "I appreciate you saying that. What changed?" She looked up at me and I saw something different in her eyes. Humility. She said, "I met people who made me see things differently. There was a woman named Patricia. She has cerebral palsy. She's brilliant, funny, determined. She's been applying for jobs for months and getting rejected, not because she's not qualified, but because companies see her disability and make assumptions. She told me about how she needs those handicapped parking spaces because getting from her car to a building entrance is exhausting for her. It's not lazy. It's not an excuse. It's her reality." Rebecca continued. She said, "I also met a veteran named Marcus. He lost both his legs serving in Afghanistan. He told me about coming home and trying to rebuild his life, about how hard it is to do simple things that I take for granted, about how many times he's gotten to a store or a restaurant and all the handicapped spaces are taken by people who don't need them, how he's had to turn around and go home because he can't make that long walk. I never thought about any of that. I never considered that my convenience was someone else's barrier." I leaned forward. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, I'm glad you had those experiences. I'm glad you met those people. That's exactly why I ordered the community service. But I need to ask you something. Is this genuine? Or is this you telling me what you think I want to hear?" She met my eyes directly. She said, "Your Honor, 6 weeks ago I would have told you whatever you wanted to hear just to get out of here. But this is real. I spent 48 hours at that center. I heard stories that broke my heart. I met people who face challenges every single day that I can't even imagine. And I realized that I've been living in a bubble where I thought money and success meant I was better than other people. I was wrong. I sat back in my chair. I said, "That's a big realization. What are you going to do with it?" She took another breath. She said, "I've actually asked Margaret if I can keep volunteering. I want to help with their job placement program. I have connections in the business community. I can help people like Patricia get interviews, get jobs. I can use my privilege for something good instead of just using it to make my own life easier. And Your Honor, I've also started a fundraiser. I'm raising money to install better accessible parking and entrance ramps at several buildings I own downtown." I have to admit I was surprised. This was more than I'd expected. I said, "That's admirable. I'm impressed." She smiled a little. She said, "I also wanted to tell you that I saw Linda Martinez at the center, the woman who was in court before me that day, the one whose mother had passed away." I looked surprised, and she explained. She said, "She volunteers there once a month. She's been doing it for years. When I met her, she didn't know who I was at first. She was just kind to me, welcoming. Later, when she realized I was the woman from court that day, she still treated me with kindness. After everything she was going through, she still had compassion for a stranger." Rebecca's voice got quiet. She said, "That taught me something too. It taught me that character isn't about how much money you have or what you own. It's about how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from it." Linda Martinez, who just lost her mother, who works night shifts as a nurse, who has every reason to be bitter about life, she treats people with grace. And I, with all my advantages, treated people like they were beneath me. I was the poor one, Your Honor. I was poor in the things that actually matter. I felt something in my chest tighten. I said, "Ms. Whitmore, Rebecca, let me tell you something. I've been on this bench for 40 years. I've seen thousands of people come through that courtroom. Most of the time, when I issue a penalty, people pay it and leave, and I never know if anything changed. They don't come back to tell me they learned something. They don't come back to apologize. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're doing this work, that tells me something about your character. It tells me that underneath the attitude and the entitlement, there's a good person who just needed to be reminded of that." She wiped her eyes. She was crying now. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for not just finding me and moving on. Thank you for making me do something hard, something uncomfortable. You changed my life. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. I'm looking at the world differently now. I'm trying to be a better person." I stood up and walked around my desk. I extended my hand to her, and she stood and shook it. I said, "I'm proud of you. Keep doing this work. Keep volunteering. Keep using your resources to help people. That's how you make amends. That's how you grow." She nodded and left my chambers. I stood there for a long moment just thinking about what had happened, about how sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about giving people the opportunity to see beyond themselves and choose to be better. I felt grateful that I trusted my instinct that day, that I hadn't just taken the easy route and issued a fine. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her at first? Or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. A few months passed. Life in my courtroom continued as it always does. The daily parade of people with problems, mistakes, circumstances. I handled each case as fairly as I could. I tried to remember my father's words about using power with mercy, about listening to people's stories, about seeing the human being in front of me, not just the case file. Then one day I got a letter in the mail at the courthouse. It was addressed to me personally. The return address said Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. I opened it, and inside was a letter from Margaret Foster. She wrote to tell me that Rebecca Whitmore had not only completed her community service, but had become one of their most dedicated volunteers. She had helped 6 people with disabilities find jobs in the past 2 months. She had donated $50,000 to renovate their facility. She had started a mentorship program connecting business professionals with people with disabilities who were entering the workforce. Margaret wrote, Judge Caprio, when you sent her to us, I wasn't sure she would learn anything. I thought she might be another person who goes through the motions without changing. I was wrong. She has become a champion for our community. She's using her influence and her resources to make real change. I wanted you to know that your decision that day, it rippled out far beyond that courtroom. You didn't just hold one person accountable. You set in motion a series of events that are helping dozens of people. Thank you for trusting us with her. I sat at my desk reading that letter over and over. I felt tears in my eyes. These are the moments that make this job worthwhile. These are the reasons I keep showing up after 40 years. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you make a decision that actually changes lives. Not just the person in front of you, but all the people that person goes on to impact. I thought about Linda Martinez, about her mother Rosa, who had worked as a housekeeper for 50 years, about how Linda had shown me a picture of her mother in a wheelchair struggling with arthritis, about how she'd told me those handicapped parking spaces made it possible for her mother to still have independence and dignity. And now, because of a parking ticket and a community service order, those spaces would be a little more respected. More people would have access. More people would be seen as the human beings they are. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who believes that character matters more than cash. Someone who believes that people can change if we give them the right opportunities. A year after the original case, I was invited to speak at an event at the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. They were celebrating the opening of their newly renovated facility. I almost didn't go. I'm not big on public speaking outside of my courtroom. But Margaret called me personally and asked me to come. She said it was important, so I went. When I arrived, I was amazed at what I saw. The building was beautiful, fully accessible. Ramps, automatic doors, wide hallways, adaptive technology everywhere. Margaret greeted me at the entrance and said, Judge, come with me. I want to show you something. She led me to a conference room where there was a plaque on the wall. It read, The Whitmore Accessibility Center, dedicated to ensuring equal access for all, funded through the generosity of Rebecca Whitmore and named in honor of the belief that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and opportunity. I stood there staring at that plaque. Margaret said she insisted on naming it this way. She said she wanted it to stand as a reminder to herself and to everyone who sees it that accessibility isn't a favor, it's a right. Judge, you did this. Your decision started this. I shook my head. I said, no, Margaret. I just pointed her in the right direction. She did the work. She chose to change. The event started, and I took my seat in the audience. There were speeches from various people. Marcus, the veteran, spoke about what the new center meant to the community. Patricia spoke about her new job in customer service and how the mentorship program had helped her gain confidence. Then Margaret introduced the final speaker, Rebecca Whitmore. Rebecca walked to the podium, and I could see she was nervous. She looked out at the crowd and she began to speak. She said, a year ago, I was a different person. I was successful in business, but I was failing as a human being. I thought money made me important. I thought rules were for other people. I parked in handicapped spaces because I couldn't be bothered to walk a little farther. I treated people as if they were beneath me, and then I got caught. She continued. She said, I went to court expecting to pay a fine and move on, but I got something much more valuable. I got a judge who saw through my attitude and gave me an opportunity to become a better person. Judge Caprio, who is here with us today, he ordered me to complete community service here at the center. I was angry at first. I thought it was excessive. I thought it was punishment, but it wasn't punishment. It was a gift. Rebecca's voice got stronger. She said, I met people here who changed how I see the world. People like Patricia, who taught me that disability doesn't mean inability. People like Marcus, who showed me what real courage looks like. People like Margaret, who welcomed me into this community even when I didn't deserve it. They taught me that accessibility isn't about special treatment. It's about basic human dignity. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves the chance to participate fully in society. She turned and looked directly at me. She said, "Judge Caprio, you could have just fined me. You could have taken my money and sent me on my way. But you did something harder. You forced me to face my own behavior. You put me in a situation where I had to see people I'd been ignoring my whole life. You believed that I could be better even when I didn't believe it myself. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for this gift." The room erupted in applause. I felt tears running down my face. I'm not ashamed to admit it. These are the moments that remind me why I became a judge. Not to punish people, not to collect fines, but to try, however imperfectly, to make our community a little more just, a little more compassionate, a little more aware of each other's struggles and dignities. After the event, people came up to me to shake my hand, to thank me, but I kept thinking about two women, Linda Martinez, who had walked into my courtroom carrying the weight of grief and had shown me the power of grace, and Rebecca Whitmore, who had walked in carrying the burden of entitlement and had chosen to transform it into service. Both of them taught me something important. Linda taught me that compassion isn't weakness. Rebecca taught me that people can change if we challenge them to. A few weeks later, I got one more letter. This one was from Linda Martinez. She wrote, "Dear Judge Caprio, I heard about the event at the Rhode Island Center for Independent Living. I heard about what Rebecca Whitmore has been doing. I wanted you to know that what you did that day in court, for both of us, it mattered more than you know. You showed me compassion when I desperately needed it, and you showed her accountability when she desperately needed that. You treated us both with exactly what we required in that moment. That's wisdom. That's justice. My mother would have been proud to know that there are still judges like you. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your integrity." I keep that letter in my desk drawer. On hard days when I'm tired and frustrated and wondering if any of this matters, I take it out and read it. It reminds me that we're all connected, that the decisions we make ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. That justice isn't just about following rules. It's about seeing people clearly and giving them what they truly need. I think about that day often, what it taught me about human nature, about how grief can make us gracious and how privilege can make us blind, about how sometimes the hardest thing we can do for someone is force them to look at themselves honestly, about how community service, real community service, isn't about checking a box. It's about building relationships, learning from people whose experiences are different from our own, recognizing our shared humanity. My father came to this country believing that America was a place where everyone could succeed regardless of where they started. He believed in hard work. He believed in family. He believed in treating people with respect. He taught me those values, and I've tried to carry them into my work every single day. After 40 years, I still believe that the law is the great equalizer. It's the tool we use to ensure that a nurse and a millionaire stand on the same ground, that a grieving daughter and an entitled businesswoman both get heard, both get justice. Money can't buy integrity. It can't buy character. It can't buy the kind of transformation that Rebecca Whitmore experienced. Those things come from within. They come from being challenged, from being uncomfortable, from being forced to see beyond our own narrow perspectives. My job isn't to make people comfortable. My job is to administer justice fairly and, when possible, to create opportunities for people to be better than they were when they walked into my courtroom. I won't be on this bench forever. I'm 78 years old. I've had a good run. But I hope that when I retire, when I take off these robes for the last time, I'll be able to say that I made a difference. Not in every case. I'm not naive enough to think that. But in some cases, in moments like the one with Linda Martinez and Rebecca Whitmore, in decisions that rippled outward and touched lives I'll never even know about, that's what I hope for. That's what keeps me coming back. and check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you there with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, grieving or entitled. That's what makes this country work. That's what makes justice possible. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. Treat people the way you want to be treated. See their humanity. Give them what they need, whether that's mercy or accountability. And never forget that we're all in this together, trying our best to live with dignity and purpose.